Welcome, everyone. I have the honor and joy of being the co-director of the Women in Public Policy program here at the Harvard Kennedy School, along with Professor Iris Bonet. We welcome you to our fall research seminar, which is focusing on exploring work and family. And so we have this semester every week another thought leading speaker who is helping us to explore the boundaries of work and family, illuminating how individual agency, institutions, policies, and social norms shape our ability to thrive in both of these realms. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Madonna Harrington Meyer, presenting on grandparenting and food insecurity in the United States. Madonna Harrington Meyer is a university professor, professor of sociology at the Maxwell School of Public Affairs, and the Laura J. and L. Douglas Meredith Professor of Teaching Excellence at Syracuse University. She is a senior research associate at the Center for Policy Research, faculty associate at the Aging Studies Institute, and faculty research affiliate at the Lerner Center. She is the author of 6 books, including Food for Thought, Understanding Older Adult Food Insecurity with Colleen Heflin. In this seminar, Professor Madonna Harrington Meyer of Syracuse will discuss a common problem in the United States, too common, that many grandparents who care for their grandchildren face food insecurity. Her talk will explain how, generally, the more care grandparents provide, the more likely they are to be food insecure. Our speaker will present for 50 minutes. Let us know if you have clarifying questions only during that time, and then we'll have 25 minutes for Q&A with the audience. For the Q&A, if you've been with us before, what we'll ask is that you put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. If you can join us in full form or full voice, we would love to unmute you and hear your question from you directly. Otherwise, I'm happy to pull your question out of the chat and share it with our speaker. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Harrington Meyer.
Thank you. Am I muted? Am I on?
You are on. You are
Okay,
on.
good.
So I'm going to
Thank
get,
you,
there we
Hannah.
go.
Thank you, Hannah, very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everybody on your team there for setting this up. I'm delighted to have all of you join us here today to talk about grandparenting and food insecurity in the US. I am going to introduce you right away to Theo. We'll come back to Theo at the very end of the talk. But here's Theo talking about how it's kind of embarrassing, actually, sometimes. The grandkids come over and they go look in the fridge and they're like, hey, there's no food over here. Theo is 66 and he and his wife take care of their grandchildren often, but they don't live with them. So this work for me actually began something like 20, maybe 25 years ago when I first became obsessed with interviewing grandparents. My first book was Grandmothers at Work. And for this book, I did not want to interview custodial grandparents. To this day, every time I talk about grandparenting, everybody thinks I'm talking about custodial grandparents. I'm not. I'm talking about the much more common experience of non-custodial grandparents. And so for this book and for several others that I've worked on, I never once raised the issue of food insecurity, but they did. And so I'll just introduce you to one person from this book. This is Candy. Candy is 43. She graduated high school only. She and her daughter live in subsidized housing, and they have a lot less money than they need. Candy works 50 hours a week as a licensed practical nurse. She's the mother of 3 and grandmother of 3, and her grandchildren are non-residential. They don't live together, but she does care for them nearly every day after work. So she says, then as soon as I think I might be able to save, they throw another baby at me. Then nobody has a good job. I haven't bought myself new underwear, but I'm buying Pampers and milk. And not because I want to, but because I get calls at 2 a.m. The baby doesn't have enough Pampers. So I come up with the money for it. It's not like, oh, I think I'll buy my grandson a bike or take them out. It's milk and things he needs day to day. I don't eat. Money is tight. I let the kids eat first. And if there's not enough food, I don't eat. Lost 6 dress sizes in 6 months from stress and exhaustion. So this came out of my earlier book, Grandmothers at Work. And I went to Colleen Heflin, who's an expert on food insecurity. And I said, maybe we should be really trying to focus on a book about food insecurity in the United States for people who are older. Now, I want to just point out that grandparents come in a lot of ages. Grandparents are as young as 30 and they're as old as 80. And you'll notice as I proceed that when I cite the literature, sometimes it's grandparents over 30, sometimes it's grandparents over 40, sometimes it's grandparents over 50, sometimes it's grandparents over 60. And so that adds a lot of dimension to this story because grandparents are really a lot of different ages. So they also have a lot of different problems. So Colleen and I have spent the last 6 or 7 years writing the book, Food for Thought, and I'm going to use data from that book for this paper here. But this paper is actually a spin-off from that book written with my grad student, Anna Delapaz. She's a wonderful sociology PhD student here at SU. And this book, or this paper, is about low-income grandparenting and food insecurity in the US. So the basic point of my talk is that feeding grandchildren contributes to food insecurity among low-income grandparents. The more care grandparents provide, the more likely they are to be food insecure. Residential grandparents, so grandparents who live with their grandkids, are providing usually the most amount of care, and they are definitely the most likely to be food insecure. But only 10% of grandparents in the US reside with their grandchildren. So I want to focus a little bit on residential grandparents, but also focus on the 90% of grandparents who are non-residential and who are overlooked. So only 10% of grandparents live with their grandchildren, but 47% of all grandparents feed their grandchildren and buy groceries for them. So there's a whole lot of feeding of grandchildren going on by non-residential grandparents. And here's the sticking point. The USDA measures food insecurity using the food security scale. And they only ask questions about feeding grandchildren if you are residential grandparents. If you live in separate households, they do not ask these questions. So what I'll come back to at the end of the talk is maybe we're undercounting food insecurity. And even though food insecurity is high in this age group, it maybe is a lot higher if we would actually ask these questions of all grandparents who are feeding grandchildren. So partly what I want to raise today is this question of what about the other 90%? The USDA is only asking about the difficulties of feeding grandchildren to the 10% who are co-residential. And I want to broaden that horizon and ask us, what about the other 90%? So just to give you a little overview of my talk, I'll be looking at both residential and non-residential grandparents. And first, I'm going to talk about 5 factors that contribute to food insecurity among grandparents. Then I'm going to look at 3 patterns grandparents adopt when feeding themselves and grandchildren on tight budgets. And I'm just going to warn you right now, these are heartbreaking stories, especially in this part about the way grandparents adapt to having too small of a budget. And then finally, I'm going to return to this issue of how we are measuring food insecurity among grandparents and ask for a broader measure. I use the life course perspective, and I feel certain you're probably all very familiar with the life course perspective. Life course perspective focuses on, in part, whether people are accumulating mostly advantages or accumulating mostly disadvantages across their life course. Everybody needs good nutrition throughout their lifetime, but people reach grandparenthood with different amounts of income, social supports, physical health, mobility, transportation resources. And these different amounts of resources help shape whether feeding the grandchildren might be contributing to food insecurity for you. So one of the things to keep in mind is that for wealthier families, feeding the grandchildren is no big deal. In fact, easily absorbed into the household budget. But for low-income families, feeding the grandchildren might be just enough to push them into food insecurity. It might be just too big of a demand on an already tight budget. So for the book Food for Thought, I collected data with my grad student team. We interviewed 63 adults 60 and older who are below 130% of the federal poverty line. So they're all low income. And we picked 130% of the federal poverty line in part because that's usually where SNAP benefits become eligible. And we wanted to capture people who would be eligible for SNAP. And you see our sample here is national, but it is not representative. So I don't use percents throughout this talk because I'm not trying to generalize from the results of my sample to a broader population. But you see that my sample is disproportionately female, disproportionately Black. We have a very high representation of people who went to college. and a very small representation of people who are married. 49% of the sample who we interviewed were food insecure, and 79% have grandchildren. Let's see, 70% of the people we interviewed have somebody in the household with a disability. It might be that person, it might be their adult child who they're taking care of. And 80% of them, 79% are using food pantries. So the sample is very diverse in some respects. It is very diverse on people's life course histories. Some of these people have been poor or near poor almost their entire lives and have a lot of experience with food insecurity. And others are new to food insecurity. They've been pushed into food insecurity by activities that happened maybe during middle age. Maybe they became disabled during middle age or lost a job or became divorced and are new to the whole challenge of food insecurity. Okay, there are really two types of residential grandparenting that I want to focus on. Both of them are increasing. Of the 10% of grandparents aged 30 and older who reside with their grandchildren, 1/3 have primary responsibility. And of them, 25% are food insecure. So that is a very high rate of food insecurity. Primary responsibility co-residential grandparents have 25% chance of being food insecure. But among all grandparents who live with their grandchildren, 15% are food insecure. And that's double what that household would be without grandchildren. So having grandchildren live with you contributes to higher levels of food insecurity. The two types of grandparenting, residential grandparenting, are on the rise for different sets of reasons. For the most part, when grandparents have primary responsibility, it's because there are difficulties with the parents. The parents might be unemployed, they might be incarcerated, they might be having struggles with substance abuse. They might have had to become custodial grandparents, which is a legal term, meaning they had to go to law and go to the courts and have their children declared incompetent parents. And they might be skip generation parents. So it might be that the grandparents live there, the grandchildren live there, but the parents aren't living there. So that's one set of residential grandparenting. The other set of residential grandparenting are grandparents who live together with the family, but they do not have primary responsibility. And this might be due to factors that affect either the parent or the grandparent. Somebody in that story has low income, maybe both generations. Somebody in that story is probably jobless or in poor health. And these things are complicated by the lack of affordable housing, the lack of affordable childcare, and also cultural preferences can play a role in whether families co-reside, even when there isn't a need for the grandparents to take primary responsibility. Okay, so the first point is residential grandparents tend to provide the most care and they are the most likely to be food insecure. But there's also an increase in non-residential grandparenting and an intensity of non-residential grandparenting. What I have found time after time in my books is that grandparents are providing more care than they expected to and more care than their parents provided for them. We've seen a real intensification of grandparenting. So grandparenting by non-residential grandparents is increasing in both frequency and in intensity. And 90% of grandparents don't live with their grandkids. So this is the group I want to bring to everybody's attention more often. Non-residential grandparents are framed by policymakers, researchers, and the media as just supplemental, occasional. And that's not the reality that I'm finding in my interviews. I'm finding grandparents who are non-residential, but who meet the bus every single day, put the kids on the bus in the morning, get them off the bus in the afternoon, take them every single weekend, take them for 2 weeks every summer. I'm finding incredibly intense amounts of care and very consistent, steady, ongoing amounts of care by non-residential grandparents. I've interviewed non-residential grandparents who have quit their jobs, taken new jobs, moved across the country, found new places to live, all so that they can provide steady, consistent care for their grandchildren. So even though they're often dismissed as occasional or just helpers, that's not the reality that I'm finding in my research at all. So there's evidence that non-residential grandparents are providing similar amounts and intensities of grandchild care as residential grandparents. And I listed a bunch of sources here, which I can come back to later in the questions if you want, but I want to kind of get to my data. So still, even though the evidence is mounting that non-residential grandparents are doing more and more care and more feeding of grandchildren, The USDA food security scale has not been changed to accommodate this. So they're still only asking these questions to the residential grandparents. So the bottom line for me is this: both residential and non-residential grandparents prioritize grandchildren's needs over their own in ways that fuel grandparent food insecurity. You'll see decision after decision after decision made by the grandparents we're interviewing, which puts the grandchildren first. And I will say this: last week, there have been so many articles in the paper about what happens if they freeze SNAP. And I will come to the policy changes at the end. But in almost every article I read, there was a grandparent who said, I make sure the kids have food first. And I thought that's exactly what I keep finding in my surveys as well. Okay. So I have 5 factors. This is based on our analysis of our 63 in-depth interviews. 5 factors that contribute to food insecurity in old age. And let me just say, we conducted these interviews in 2021. So COVID was sort of on the wane. We tried to conduct them in 2019 and 2020, and we got nowhere. So we just paused, and then we came back as COVID was starting to be on the wane. Vaccines were starting to be available, and things were starting to open back up. So people could get to the food pantry more easily. They could get to the Senior Citizen Center for a congregate meal more easily. So that's when we collected this data. And these are the 5 themes that emerged from our data about what are the main factors that make it difficult to be a grandparent and to feed your grandchildren if you're low income. So first one up is insufficient income. So that's obvious. I know if you don't have enough money, you don't have enough money for food. Food insecurity comes usually with a web of insecurities. Usually, if you're having difficulty with food insecurity, you're having difficulty with other things too: paying the rent, paying for transportation, paying for your medical care. All of these things tend to contribute as well. So here's Ophelia. She's 69. She lives in a grandparent-headed household. So this is a residential grandparent situation. She lives with her daughter, her pregnant granddaughter, and her grandson. So they are about to become a 4-generation household. Their household budget is already very, very tight. There's not much money left for food. So Ophelia tells us, because after I pay the rent, I've got only a little bit left. And out of that, I've got to pay the gas, electrical bill, my phone bill, and utilities. She says it is preferable to be hungry over homeless. We heard this from so many of the people we interviewed: better to be hungry than homeless. They can imagine how they will get by without their next meal. They cannot imagine how they will get by without a roof over their heads. And so they have to prioritize housing and utilities over food because they cannot risk becoming homeless. So Ophelia says, I'd rather go hungry than not pay rent. I say I'd rather be without a little food and not, being able to pay rent, because I'm always going to try to keep a roof over my head. Ophelia tells us that she feeds the grandchildren until she runs out of food, and then she goes to the pantry to get more food. I would feed them, I would run out of food, and I had to go to church to get some food. This is Theo, who you met at the very beginning. He and his wife feed their non-residential grandkids about 5 times a week. So very, very often. And they do not have enough money for food. So after the rent is paid, we're broke. Once I pay those bills and pay the rent and pay on my car, I don't have anything left. And I pick up junk every now and then. Well, like just this morning, I made $10.40, and I can get a carton of milk for him. So they have very few pennies to put together to buy groceries, and he has to work very, very hard. He told me stories about having to collect and recycle cans, metals, in order to go to the dentist. He hadn't been in years, in order to buy milk, in order to put gas in the car so that they could drive to the food pantry. This is a family that is really on the brink. They're having a very difficult time. And when I think about the possibility of SNAP benefits being frozen, I think they're already so tight. This is not a delay in benefits or a shortage in benefits that these families they can't absorb that delay. So this is Carmen. She's 65, and she makes dinner for her non-residential granddaughter about twice a week. She has very low food insecurity. Her income barely covers her monthly bills. Exactly what I have, because the mortgage is $400. My phone bill, my water bill, when I come to check the bank, sometimes I have $6 or $7 left. People, when we interview them, very often know exactly how many dollars were in their bank accounts. On a daily basis, they're checking because that's all they've got. The second set of things I want to talk about are difficulties navigating SNAP. Now, in order to be eligible for SNAP, you have to live in the same household with your grandchildren if you're going to count them as part of your eligibility criteria. So here with non-residential grandparents, they have to be eligible for SNAP on their own right, but they don't get any credit for how often they're feeding the grandchildren. So SNAP is a very important program, and it really helps relieve food insecurity in the United States. It's a vital program, but it's not necessarily user-friendly. That's my set of words for it. Other people call this administrative burden. Indeed, the amount of administrative burden with SNAP is very high. It is so high, only 55% of adults ages 60 and older who are eligible actually get the benefits. And among skip generation low-income households, so grandparents who are with grandchildren in skip generation households, only 42% of those who are eligible participate. So the participation rates are very, very low. Why are they so low? In our book, we really focus on this question for a while, and the answers are some people don't know they're eligible. They've maybe never been eligible for a poverty-based program before. They don't know how they work. Some of them are not able to overcome all the administrative paperwork, the amount of records, how many visits to the office, how many phone calls they have to wait for. It's just too much. And some of them find that the administrative burden isn't worth the hassle because the benefits themselves are so low. So SNAP benefits, when we conducted these surveys, were $16 a month. The minimum benefit was $16 a month. It is now up to $23 a month. But in either case, you know, $23 is barely enough for your lunch. I mean, it's not going to feed a family across a month. And yet that is a monthly benefit. So the benefits are very, very low. The other thing to keep in mind about SNAP is that while it is a vital program, it's good for older people, it's good for grandparents, and it's good for the economy. Nearly all the money that we give families for SNAP, they turn right around and spend in local economies. They help us get out of recessions. They keep your grocery stores open. And when we give people SNAP, that opens up food money in the budget for non-food items. So in addition to buying food, if we give them SNAP, they can also buy new backpacks or new tennis shoes for the kids, that kind of thing. So about 40% of all households receiving SNAP are still food insecure, even when they've got those benefits. And in 2023, that number rose up to 52%. So SNAP is a very vital, important program, but it does not eliminate food insecurity for a lot of families. A lot of families remain food insecure, even though they have SNAP benefits. So here's Maggie. She's 63. She completed high school and she lives alone in subsidized housing. She has lupus, arthritis, and high blood pressure, and frequently cares for her 6 non-residential grandchildren. She's frustrated by the seemingly ever-changing amount of her SNAP benefit. We heard a lot of people say this. The benefit seems to just change from month to month to month, and they don't know why. If they have any change in their income, if their Social Security check changes, then their benefits from SNAP might change. So she says, we get the little $20 increase of Social Security check, or the food stamps go up $2. It's a lot. So I was getting $16. I was getting $12. I was getting $200. I was getting $97. I was getting $76. So it just all depends on whatever the government decides to give us. Of course, the benefits aren't really quite this random, but this is how it feels to families when they're trying to feed their grandchildren and they have a very small amount of money. It feels like the money comes, the money doesn't come, it's bigger, it's smaller, and they don't really know why. And here's another person who has struggled with SNAP. Kira is 68 and she cares for her non-residential grandchildren often. She receives $135 a month from SNAP, but she's overwhelmed by the paperwork. Well, I hate doing all that damn paperwork once a year. I mean, God, I haven't changed anything. Stop putting me through this. I recently be certified for food stamps and I'm just, goodness gracious, I'm poor. Leave me alone. And a lot of people we interviewed echoed this kind of sentiment. The paperwork is just too much. And this is Julie. Julie uses her modest SNAP benefit quickly and then relies on the food pantry and on congregate meals for supplements. We only get $66 a month in food stamps. Some months, you know, there's not enough for food. Running out of SNAP benefits before the end of the month makes grandparents more likely to be food insecure, and it makes grandparenting more difficult. Carmen describes how her $234 a month SNAP benefit lasts the first 2 weeks of the month, and then the food ran out, and she said she had no money to restock. Very often people who get SNAP benefits talk about how it's gone by the middle of the month. So the months are too long for the size of the benefits that they get. A third factor that really can affect whether grandparents are food insecure when they're feeding their grandchildren are issues related to transportation. You have to go somewhere to get food. That's just the bottom line. You have to go to a grocery store or a food pantry or a soup kitchen or a senior citizen center or a grocery store. You have to go somewhere to get food. And transportation can be very, very difficult for low-income families. So in our book, we found that among all adults ages 50 to 64, 18% had transportation problems that limited access to food within the last 2 weeks. And among all those 65 and older, 12% had transportation problems that limited their access to food. So transportation problems are common for older adults in the United States, and they absolutely contribute to food insecurity. And they do for grandparents as well. So here's Carmen. She tells me that catching the bus is very difficult, especially when it's cold. So she asks for rides with friends. And nearly everybody who talked about getting rides with friends said they had to offer them money. These are low-income people being helped by other low-income people. And so they can't just get a free ride. They have to offer some help with the gas expenses for this free ride. So yeah, sometimes in the wintertime, it's hard for me to catch the bus because I've got to walk all the way down the street and stand in the bus stop and wait for the bus. And sometimes it'd be really cold. But sometimes if I have a few dollars to give my friend for gas, I guess she'll take me. So transportation can be a big problem. And Ophelia tells us she doesn't own a car and she pays $2.50 per ride on public transportation. But sometimes she doesn't have the $2.50. And so she said, I have to pay $2.50 each way. Sometimes I would go to the market and I would just have enough money to call a cab, which was $3. But there was a couple times when I didn't even have money to get to the market. So sometimes they told me my SNAP benefit came, but I didn't have any gas money. So I couldn't go spend it at the grocery store. I couldn't get to the grocery store. And $2.50 per ride doesn't sound like much if you're a middle income person, but if you're a low income person on a very tight budget, $2.50 per ride is way too much. It really crushes that monthly budget. And here's Tilly. Tilly lives with her husband and her grandson. She uses a wheelchair, and so she's only able to go to the food pantry if somebody can drive her. She tries to visit the food pantry that loads, she has a choice of some food pantries, and she tries to go to the one where they will load the groceries into her trunk for her because that's one less step that she's got to worry about with her wheelchair. Once a week, we have 3 different food pantries. I usually try to pick up at 2 because I'm in a wheelchair. I can't always go. She can only go if her husband or her grandson are there to give her a ride to the food pantry. And it's important that they do that because it's them she's feeding. She's feeding herself and her husband and a grandchild. So the transportation can be a big problem. And here's Theo. I want to just pause here for a second and say, a lot of people live in places where there is no public transportation at all. And other people live in places where there is transportation, but it's too hard to get to it. It's too many blocks, it's uphill. And the bus doesn't come, and it doesn't come on time. And you see people standing at bus stops for long periods of time in the cold and in the hot and in the rain and in the sun, waiting for that bus to come. So public transportation is not very reliable, even if it is in your neighborhood. But owning your own car can also be a huge problem for low-income families. We interviewed people who can't drive at night because they don't have a headlight. They can't drive in the winter because they don't have a heater. They can't drive in the summer because they don't have an air conditioner. People really struggle with driving their own cars. And very often they don't have enough money for gas for their own car. And another big thing is inspections. You have to have your car inspected every year. Then you get a list of things that need to be fixed. Many of the people we interviewed couldn't drive their cars at all because they couldn't meet the inspection requirements to get back on the road. So when Theo walks to the bus stop, he gets short-winded and feels the poor circulation in his legs. We got to go 2 lights, 3 lights, and then the hill to get up before we can get to the bus on the main highway. He and his wife would prefer to drive their car, but they're struggling to fund repairs. Sometimes they're unable to get food at the senior nutrition sites because they lack money for gas. Right now I've got a taillight out and then my heater. And they want to tell me $500 to fix that because I just don't have it. I told my wife, I said, well, we just have to put on thick coats and some blankets. We don't go at night. We go to the food pantry, but sometimes we don't have the gas. So transportation is a problem, whether it's public or private. We heard really difficult stories related to transportation. The next thing, and this is so confounding, is the limited availability of healthy food. It's actually very difficult if you're low income to get your hands on healthy food. So at the grocery store, fruits and vegetables are very, very expensive, and they're often in bulk amounts. So people talked about how hard it is because they can't afford the bulk amounts. At my grocery store here locally, and I have fought with my manager about this, but lost, you can buy one box of fruit, and then if you buy one box, you get one box. If you buy two, you get five. That's how bulk pricing works. And so for a person who's living alone and who's low income, buying two to get five doesn't make any sense. And it's a budget buster. They absolutely can't do it. So all the things that we know we're supposed to eat, fruits, vegetables, lean meats, that kind of thing, these are the most expensive things at the grocery store. And when you find them on the discount rack, it's because they're about to go bad. They're about to expire. So Ophelia says she tries to buy fruits and vegetables, but often she runs out of money for food, and the scarcity of produce affects how she's feeling. I don't think I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. I feel terrible. Ophelia was one of the few people we talked to who actually talked about how it was affecting not just her physical health, but her mental cognitive abilities as well. Carmen knows that obtaining healthy food is important because she's diabetic, and she knows how important that is. But it's hard. Being diabetic is hard. It's expensive to buy diet food. The doctor says you've got to have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and in between, you've got to have a snack. Yeah. Once or twice a month, maybe 3 times a month, I eat vegetables. That's it. That's all she can afford. And actually, that was one of the higher amounts of some of the people we interviewed. So if you're not buying your food at the grocery store, the other way to get food is through free and subsidized food programs that are community-based. So food pantries, soup kitchens, senior citizen centers that have congregate meals, and food giveaways. And across every one of those sources, you generally get food that is boxed or canned, highly processed, high in fat, sodium, and sugar content, not foods that are good for you, and particularly not foods that are good for you if you have any chronic conditions. So Theo is only permitted to go to the food pantry in his neighborhood once a month, and sometimes the quality of that food on offer is very poor. Often the pantry food is canned in meat, and the meat is compromised. The canned goods, I've gotten meat there that won't be too good, freezer burnt meat. I think what people don't really understand about going to the food pantry is you can't just go. You have to get certified. There's administrative burden related to the food pantry and the soup kitchen. You have to prove where you live. You have to prove that you're poor enough to be eligible. And then there are rules. You're only permitted to come every so often. The food pantry in my town is open for 2 hours a week. That's it. If you can't come during that window, you don't get any. The food pantry near campus in Syracuse recently started to close every other weekend. Right now, when SNAP is being frozen and when SNAP is being cut and when Medicaid is being cut, they've had to switch to closing every other weekend. So my grad student who actually is doing her dissertation observing there just sent me a note right before I came online with you to say that when they opened the doors Saturday morning, there was nearly a riot. People were so desperate to get in the door to get food. And she's been there for almost 2 years. She's never seen anything like it. So it's not just that the lines are long, and it's not that it's difficult to get certified. It's actually they're going to run out of food before you get yours. So what you see at food pantries is people who are there in line 4 or 5 hours before they open in order to get the fruits and the vegetables before they're all gone, or in order to get some meat that's not freezer burned. There's just not enough good, healthy food available at the grocery store, and there's just not enough good, healthy food available at these free and subsidized food options. So here's Alex and his wife. They get as much food as they possibly can from the food pantry, but often they have to leave without meat. Last week when I went to both food pantries, I didn't get meat from either one. The food pantries always have a lot of produce, but sometimes it's on the verge of going bad and you don't get much of it. It's really used to bother me to sort of throw out that much food. And I'm going, well, we were the last stop before the trash can anyway. So Alex buys his food at the dollar store. And we heard a lot of people say this. They're buying frozen, boxed, and canned food at the dollar store because it's cheap. Well, it is low in price, but it's also low in nutritional value. So Alex says, it's not the real chicken breasts and roasted vegetables that we should be eating. Sometimes we get inexpensive microwave dinners and just eat those. Between Dollar General and Dollar Tree, going to the food pantries, that's how we do it. That's how we get by. The last thing is that as people are getting older, they're more likely to have poor health. They might have chronic conditions, functional limitations, disabilities, And the single most common limitation that older people have are mobility limitations. Well, when I said you have to go somewhere to get food, you have to go somewhere to get food. You need transportation, but you also need mobility. You've got to be able to walk up and down the aisles or stand in line. You've got to wait your turn, that kind of thing. So having poor health and mobility and stamina makes it difficult to go get food. Among those 65 and older, 80% have at least one chronic condition and 50% have two or more. 20% rate their health as fair or poor, and 20% have functional limitations. And those are most often linked to mobility. So any of these health problems, as you're getting older, you're more likely to get them. As you're getting them, you're more likely to be food insecure. And then it's a three-part formula because it also makes it harder to get the food. It's more difficult to get the food if you have any of these problems. So here's Ophelia. Her health is only fair. She has multiple chronic conditions that make walking and standing in line difficult. She's frustrated by the distance she has to travel to get food at the pantry. Ophelia augments her food by going to food giveaways, which often require walking and waiting in lines. I most likely would have to take a long walk to get there or use transportation. See, because the area of the city I live in, they don't give out much. Once a month in the summer, I would go stand in a line that was giving out food. The US gives out free and subsidized commodity food, and you will see very, very long lines of people waiting to get this free and subsidized food. Part of the problem with waiting in line to get food like that is you get whatever you get. And I want to say that the volunteers at these food giveaways are working very, very hard to do the absolute they can. But you're going to very likely get a box full of things, only some of which you're able to use based on your dietary needs and requirements. I interviewed a woman who waited a long time to get food, and she got a box of plastic bags of chocolate syrup. And I interviewed a woman who got a big plastic bag of spreadable cheese. I interviewed people who got bags of sausage. And while that might sound fun at first, a lot of sausage is really not good for you. And, after a little while, you can't really look at it anymore. So what you get at the food giveaways depends entirely on what is donated. And if you have poor health and poor stamina, you might be waiting in line a long time to get not very much. You might not get very much in terms of a reward for how long you've had to stand there. Here's Diane. She has poor physical health and poor mental health, and she's making it difficult to obtain and prepare food to feed her non-residential granddaughter every day. She often has no transportation to the pantry, and she does not feel alert enough to push the cart, especially during poor weather. She lives in pain, and she's contemplating suicide. This was definitely one of the more difficult and challenging interviews that we did. My capacity isn't that good. She also is mentioning cognitive decline here. My focus is not really that good for me to be going. You've got to push a cart, it's cold, rain, it's different things, or the weather is too hot. So when you get to a certain age, you don't want to do a lot of things. I force myself to get up every time my legs is on fire. If I had a choice, I would take a pill and end it all. I don't have that choice. The reason she doesn't have that choice is because she takes care of her non-residential granddaughter every single day. And she has no choice to end it, but she would very much like to because she's in so much pain and it's just so difficult to manage day to day. Okay, so I mentioned that this last part is even sadder. Not that that part wasn't already pretty sad, but you might need to take a breath as we go through this last little part of my talk here. In the analysis of the data, we found three patterns, three ways that grandparents are accommodating feeding their grandchildren and themselves when the budgets are too small. The first one is that they delay their own meals until the grandchildren have eaten. They let the grandkids eat the fruits, the vegetables, the lean meats, the milk, the cheese, and they eat whatever is left over. The second one is they skip meals entirely. They go without food. And the third one is they limit how much time they spend with their grandchildren. When feeding becomes financially untenable, they have no choice but to not see their grandchildren as much as they would. So here's the first one, delaying meals. Julie, age 62, who lives with her 14-year-old grandson in the house. I'm having to move, here we go. Delays her meals until after her grandson has eaten enough of the more nutritious food. She struggles to provide enough produce, milk, and meat. I worry about some for feeding my grandson. I can't afford, the fresh fruits and vegetables and stuff, the milk, like Wait. Like the meat, essential needs of a growing child. I may go without that and eat something else because I'm going to provide it for him. Sometimes Julie does not eat so that there's enough healthy food for him. I normally eat 2 meals a day. It just depends. I might eat breakfast or I might not. I might eat lunch or might not, but it's usually at night. Indeed, for people who are skipping meals, we found they very consistently eat at night so that they can sleep. If they can't get any sleep, then it just compounds all of their problems. And if they're hungry or worried about being hungry, it's too hard to sleep at night. So when they have to skip meals, they try to make sure they get a meal at nighttime. Valerie also delays her meals until after the grandkids have had the more nutritious food. So she is 68 and she cares for her 12-year-old non-residential grandson every weekend. I walk to get him. We bring the bus back. When I take him home, I take the bus to take him home and walk back home. So she's getting a lot of exercise, picking him up and dropping him off. She cooks for little for herself during the week and then cooks a great deal for him on the weekends. I cook a lot when my grandson's here. I don't cook too much during the week as far as meals go. I'll fix a sandwich or something. I'll fix a pot roast and I'll be lucky if I get a plate. He will sit there and eat 3 plates, and if there's any left, he'll eat it in the morning. So she's doing without so that he has enough. And here's Carmen. Carmen receives SNAP and she eats congregate meals. And when her cash is gone, she makes sure she has enough for weekly dinners with her non-residential granddaughter by turning to bread and mayonnaise for herself. She's literally eating bread and mayonnaise sandwiches in order to save food for her grandchild. Sometimes, like the end of the month, I don't have much to eat. Oh yeah, I eat less. I cut down a lot. Really, it's not enough. It's not enough. I try to stretch it as much as I can. I'm going to tell you the truth. It's hard because at the end of the month, I don't have a penny to my name. Right now, I've got $14 in the bank until I get paid again. Skipping meals altogether. So Theo, as you know, he scraps metal to buy food for his 1-year-old grandchild and gas for the car so they can get to the pantry in the grocery store. And during the interview, he told us if we don't have the egg or the bread, something like that, I just don't eat. Anyway, 2 or 3 times a month, I would go without it myself to give them some food. As long as my family gets something to eat, I'm all right. Theo has skipped so many meals that he's lost weight and he's grown accustomed to the shortage of food. Well, to tell you the truth, yes, ma'am, I did. I have not eaten all day. 2 or 3 times a month, I'm used to it. Theo typically leaves what little meat they have for the grandchildren. Yes, ma'am, I get me some pinto beans and cornbread. I'm good to go. I don't have to have no meat. Meat's been harder to come by. It won't last as long. Ophelia also skips meals so that the grandkids have enough food. She's relied on home delivered meals, commodity food giveaways, and SNAP benefits to reduce food insecurity. Her family's been trying to enter subsidized housing, and that would really free up budgetary space for more food, but they've not been able to get in. In the meantime, she skips meals when the monthly SNAP benefits have not yet arrived, when the grandkids need more food, and when she no longer has enough food to feed everyone. Sometimes I just have enough food for maybe breakfast and dinner. I'm going to make sure the kids eat, even if I don't. And then the last one is actually curtailing time with the grandchildren. And I didn't see this one coming. This one surprised me, in part because she's already stretching her modest income as tightly as she can. Maggie, age 63, declines some requests for babysitting her 6 grandchildren. She tries to minimize how often she cares for them so that she can minimize how often she has to feed them. I try not to let them, don't make a habit of it. I don't mind doing it sometimes, but don't take advantage of it. She's talking to her adult child. I'll take care of them sometimes, but I can't do it all the time. And here's Alex. Alex's struggle with food insecurity limits the time that he and his wife can spend with their grandchildren, and that is contributing to their social isolation and diminishing their mental health. You all know that loneliness is bad for us, and loneliness is definitely bad for low-income grandparents who are food insecure. Because, the grandkids or something, they all want to go out and eat and everything, and we really can't afford it. We have to turn stuff down, If we know that we're going to have to pony up financially, yeah, I'd like to be able to take the grandkids out for ice cream. When they know that food is on the line, they have to sometimes decline seeing them. And here's the last one. This is where I started the talk. Theo's humiliated when the grandkids come over and say, it's kind of embarrassing actually sometimes. Grandkids come over and they go look in the fridge and they're like, hey, there's no food over here. So I set out to end by returning to this question of measurement. Here's what we use to measure food security in the United States. This is the food security scale, and the USDA analyzes it every year. And there are 10 questions that everybody gets asked. And then there are 8 more questions if there are children living in the household. So I was saying at the beginning, only residential grandparents get asked these 8 questions. But we made a mistake. When we collected the data, we did it wrong. And sometimes mistakes are fabulous, I think. We asked Theo and some of the other grandparents all 18 questions. We shouldn't have because they were non-residential. But we did because they were talking about feeding their grandkids so much, we didn't even really think to stop. We just asked them all 18 questions. So when we asked Theo the official 10 questions that we were supposed to ask him, his food security score was 10 out of 10. He said yes to all 10 questions. When we asked him the other questions, he said yes to 3 more. So in fact, in reality, his food security score would be 13 out of 18 if we asked him all the questions. So part of our point here is that the US may be undercounting food insecurity, especially among non-residential grandparents. Why not ask all 18 questions to grandparents, whether they are residential or not? And so that's why I'm so preoccupied with talking about the remaining 90%. We're asking this full set of questions to all grandparents would change how well we understand and know and keep our measurement of food insecurity among non-residential grandparents. Okay, last up, I was saying to Hannah before this talk, it's difficult to talk about a current event with this administration in office because things change so much. And I updated myself before this started, and I might need to update myself right now midstream. Maybe one of you can update me. So these are changes that have happened just this year that are going to make everything I've just said even more difficult for grandparents. In 2025, the USDA cut $1 billion, half of it through the Emergency Food Assistance Program and half of it through the Local Food Purchase Assistance Cooperative Agreement Program. They cut $1 billion in a way that hurts food pantries. Some of that money has now been released, but lines at food pantries went up during COVID and they've basically stayed up. And now they're up even higher. All the federal government employees that are furloughed, all of the people whose other kinds of budgets, other kinds of benefits have been cut, are turning to food pantries for assistance. Then in 2025, also, one big beautiful bill, I have to put that in quotes, cut Medicaid by $1 trillion over the next decade, and that is supposed to increase uninsurance by 10 million. Now, you might not be thinking that that's going to affect food insecurity, but it is, because we found families are making incredible budget trade-offs. I have to decide, pay the rent or buy food, fix the car or buy food, but I also do it with medical care. Do I go to the doctor or do I buy food? Do I go to the dentist or do I buy food? Do I fill my prescription or do I buy food? So a lot of people are taking the pill once a day when they're supposed to take it twice a day, or taking it every other day, or not going to the doctor or the dentist for 8 and 9 and 10 years. And if you're a person who's 60 or older, that is a very difficult strategy to then try to recover from. And then you all know that the One Big Beautiful Bill also cut $187 billion from SNAP over the next decade. And I think it's obvious how cutting people from SNAP is going to make food insecurity more difficult. But I think the part people might not realize is they also implemented a work requirement up to the age of 64. So right now the work requirement had been lower, a lower age cutoff, and now it's all the way up to age 64. And I'll just say that the thing that surprised me most in working on this project was how badly things could go off the rail in middle age. People who owned a home, who'd raised their kids, who seemed to be doing fine, could have one mishap in middle age, just send them into very low income situations. Maybe they lost their job, maybe they were laid off, maybe they became disabled, maybe they got hurt on the job, maybe they became divorced or became widowed, or one of their children became disabled. Any one of these things can be enough to make it difficult for you to have enough money and enough livelihood for food. So if they're cutting Medicaid, we're going to see even more budget trade-offs between food and medical expenses. And that is a big alarm for us. The next big thing that happened was I just spent 40 minutes telling you I wish that they would ask the food security scale, all 18 questions, to all the grandparents. They've actually stopped asking it all together. So the food security scale is completely frozen right now. They've eliminated the funding for it, and they're saying we will not have any new data next year on food security in the United States. So obviously bringing back that scale would be helpful, but in my mind, when we bring it back, we should also broaden the way we're using it. And then finally, and this is the one that's changing by the minute, in just these last few weeks during the government shutdown, they said first they would not have SNAP benefits at all. Then they said they would have SNAP benefits. This has gone back and forth through the courts. When I started this talk, the appeals court had said that the Trump administration had to release full benefits in the month of November. But the Trump administration also said they were going to go back to the Supreme Court with another appeal. So how this will play out, I don't know. But what I do know for sure is that any delay at all in receiving these benefits is very, very hard on families. They are counting the days till their next SNAP benefit shows up on their card. And if it's delayed by even a week or 2 weeks or cut in half, this is really going to present a lot of difficulties for the families who we interviewed. Okay, let me stop right there and see what kinds of questions people have, comments people want to make.
Thank you very much. That is a compelling presentation. We're getting some rising, you can see the applause coming up from the group. Thank you very much for sharing this really important research with us. Yes, as Alexia is sharing, so sad, but so incredibly important to understand. I want to make sure I'm not cutting ahead of anybody else. Please raise virtual hands. Maybe make sure I've got my gallery up so I can see any virtual hands. I'm wondering if I'd love to start by, I have some questions about the food security scale, which I had heard was cut and felt pain by, but now you've really, got this front and center for us. And I had a couple questions. Maybe I can give you both. One is this is a lot to absorb, all these questions while also listening to you. And so I was wondering, in part, if you could give us talk a little bit more about what these questions 11 to 18 are getting at,
Right.
that you wanted to add back in. Why are these relevant? Right. Why should we be asking everybody about this? And then maybe relatedly, are there any alternatives for getting these data, at the state level, or through, I don't know, research institutes? So if I could just let you riff for a moment with those questions.
Well, let me actually broaden that even a little bit more and say, even the first 10 questions, all they ask is, do you have enough money for food? They ask that same question in a lot of different ways. Every single question asks whether you have enough money for food, except for number 3. Yeah, even number 3. They don't ask about the quality of the food you have. They ask if you have enough money to buy food. They don't ask about the quality of that food, and they don't ask if there are any non-financial reasons for you to not have enough food. So those are our 2 biggest critiques in the book about this scale. So we worried whether our food would run out before we got money to buy more. The food we just bought didn't last. We didn't have money to get more. It's the same question over and over and over again. We couldn't afford to eat balanced meals. So we would like to see this broaden, even the first 10 questions, brought into focus more on the quality of the food. You might have food, but it might be a frozen dinner from the dollar store.
Right.
And we would also like to see the non-financial factors taken into account. Is transportation getting in the way of you having food? Is poor health, mobility, and stamina getting in the way of you having food? Those sorts of things. Then the questions 11 through 18, we relied on only a few kinds of low-cost food to feed our children because we were running out of money to buy food. Still the same questions about if you have enough money for food. The children were not eating enough because we just couldn't afford enough food. In the last 12 months, did you ever cut the size of the children's meals because there wasn't enough money for food? Again, it's only asking if you have enough money for food. Did you ever have a day that any of the children did not eat for a whole day because there wasn't enough money for food? So these are the kinds of questions that are being asked. So we would like to see them broaden to look at the quality of the food and the non-financial factors that are affecting food insecurity. And I especially would like to see them broaden so that non-residential grandparents get asked these 18. Because you saw that Theo's story got a lot more severe when we asked him all of the questions. And I will say that the grandparents that we asked all the 18 questions to, even when they were non-residential, many of them said yes to several to the grandchildren questions as well. So if we freeze this, is somebody else going to pick up the slack? Maybe. I think My understanding is it's a little more than $1 million to run this thing every year. So it didn't, I want to be clear about this. We didn't freeze, we didn't cut the budget for doing this every year to save money because it's not very much money to save. And we did it to not have the information. And I think what we need to keep in mind is we're going to have food insecurity whether we measure it or not. It'll show up at the food pantry. It'll show up with children who haven't had enough food when they get to school. It'll show up at the doctor's office when people have nutritional based health problems. We're going to have food insecurity whether we measure it or not. The fact that it's only a little more than $1 million to run it does make me slightly optimistic that a research group might be able to pick it up and execute it themselves. So sort of privatize the cost of doing it, but still have the data. I think that's everybody's hope. I mean, everybody's real hope is that they actually just reinstitute the budget and do it. But if not, then maybe that's where we're headed.
And then relatedly, you use the example of somebody who would have come in as a 10 out of 10 on the if only asked questions 1 through 10.
Yeah. So Theo was
Theo,
10,
yeah, give me Theo. But then you said they would have, but you compared a 10 out of 10 to a 13 over 10. I was wondering if you could give us like any sense of, is there a threshold to get access to services or yeah?
I should have explained that. So if you say yes to 1 or 2 of any of these top 10 questions, or actually any of these questions, 1 or 2 means you have marginal food security, and we don't call that food insecure.
Okay.
So you might say yes to 1 or 2 of these, and we wouldn't even call you food insecure. If you say yes to 3 through 5, then we say you have low food security. And if you say yes to 6 or more, then we say you have very low food security. Now, this is just so we have some sense of how dire your situation is, but it's not part of the application for SNAP, for example. And it's not part of the application to go to the food pantry or to go to the food giveaway. Those are based entirely on your income, the amount of money in your household compared to the number of people in your household. So whether you're food insecure, actually, not everybody on SNAP is food insecure, and not everybody who gets SNAP becomes food secure. So it's actually unrelated.
Okay, that's important. But it's also important with regard to what are the motivations for cutting it. You know what I mean? So it's not as if this is an instrument that would overload the number of people on services or something like that. This is just independent assessment for information for policy analysis. And
it's information for policy analysis. And because they do it at the national level, we can tell you how food insecurity looks in Syracuse last year to this year, or how it looks in your town this year compared to last year. So it provides really rich, important data, and they can zero in on state level and county level data within the food security scale. So it really helps local providers know how are things looking, what does the food pantry need to do to get ready? What do the soup kitchens need to do to get ready for the demand that's headed their way?
So Firmask is actually asking a related question about the granularity of the data. Do you want to hop in, Firmask, and talk about and ask your question? And maybe what are you thinking about from a policy perspective, or?
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your seminar. It was very sad, but seeing this data is very important actually. So I am writing my assignment actually on food insecurity. So I found this event. So I am just wondering if the data is collected is for one states or it is done in multiple states, and if you found any like differences between the food insecurity level between the states, or you feel like it is all the same and all affected by the same policy? This is my question.
So it is national data, and so we have data for all states. And I think you can even look county by county if you want to. And I think local providers do that. Is food insecurity worse in some states than other states? Absolutely. So the southern states, the kind of Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, those southern states, which tend to be more red in their orientation, have higher levels of food insecurity. So it's interesting to look at because some states have higher levels of food insecurity and other states have higher levels of SNAP participation. These things fluctuate tremendously by state. And that's actually one of our critiques of the US response to food insecurity is where you live determines what you get. So we do use a life course approach, but we also use a social capital approach where we say, you might be able to overcome your food insecurity because the food pantry in your neighborhood is open 5 days a week, and it's open 8 hours a day, and it has lots of fresh produce, and it lets you come every week. Whereas remember, one of the people I interviewed here is only permitted to go once a month. So some states really put out a welcome mat and they make it easy to come and get more food, and some states make it much more difficult to come and get more food. So I don't know, did I answer all of that part of that question? Ask me more if I missed any part of that. For Misk? I hope I got to all of it.
Yeah, I think you did. I think you did.
Okay, good.
And, for Mask, it looked like you got unmuted. Go ahead. Yes.
Oh, yeah. I tried to speak, but I was muted. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, you answered, but I just a follow-up question. Like you mentioned, like 5 factors. So I was just wondering if even the differences between these factors from state to state is different. Like, for example, SNAP, maybe some states have like the SNAP problem, some other states have the transportation. Did you get did you like make any differences between these factors according to states?
Right. So we cannot do that at all with my qualitative data, right? Because that's just 63 people. So we can't make any kind of observations like that with my qualitative data. But for the book Food for Thought, Colleen did quantitative analysis, and we were able to show real differences in how many food pantries there are, real differences in how many soup kitchens there are, what proportion of the people who are eligible are actually on SNAP. Some states have more generous benefits and easier ways to get on, and other states have more smaller benefits and more challenges in your application process. So yeah, we saw tremendous state variation.
And I imagine transportation differs widely. I mean, not only across states, but even what county you're in and the degree to which.
Right. So that's like an urban rural thing too.
Urban,
So rural
rural,
people
yeah.
have no options usually for public transportation. But urban people, even if there is a good bus system in your town, it doesn't mean it's a good bus system for your neighborhood where you live.
Right.
And so people talked about doing, honestly, very unsafe commutes to the bus. I mean, things that made me very nervous for their health and well-being. Some of the stories were very troubling to hear what people went through to get to the bus. And then the thing about taking the bus to go get your food is you now have to get home with the food on the bus. And so if you have trouble with steps, it's one thing to get up on that bus, but then to get back up on that bus with your groceries is just going to be almost impossible for a lot of people. So people in the interviews talked about using hand over hand over hand to get upstairs, grabbing the railings and pulling themselves up. You can't do that with groceries in your hand. And so, yeah, the transportation thing, it really can vary even in your own big urban area. You might live in a neighborhood that's kind of like a transportation ghetto and a place or a vacuum, and then a place that's got really wonderful transportation. You know that apartment rents are higher wherever there's a good cross of transportation, right? So, I mean, that's people pick their apartments in part so that they're near the subway or near the bus.
Right.
And so you're going to pay more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And then obviously there's food desert questions and things like that, where people will be more expensive also, all having those amenities of the food and things like that next to you. Can I shift a little bit? I want to go back to, I'd love to ask you some questions, high level quant questions, and I don't know whether I'm guessing you'll be familiar with them, and then go into just get a little bit more, hear a little bit more about your methods of and sample and things. But yeah, exactly. So you had mentioned that there is this rising proportion of grandparents who are providing care to grandchildren. And I just wonder whether you have any sense of what is explaining that trend. Are there any policy analyses that help us to understand why we're seeing grandparents stepping in to support with childcare?
Yeah. So when it comes to grandparents with primary responsibility, there are definitely things that have happened that have made that group increase. And the numbers went up pretty substantially in the 90s, and now they've leveled off somewhat. But they went up during a period when there was high parental unemployment, high substance abuse. So we're talking about, drug abuse, and also high rates of incarceration. So when mass incarceration was underway, every time you imprison parents, you're leaving children in need of care then. And so we were mass incarcerating a lot of people during the late 90s and the early O's. And so, yeah, there were very definite factors that were increasing grandparents living together with primary responsibility. In my interviews in the earlier book, what I found was that grandparents are loath to become custodial grandparents. If they can possibly avoid it, they do, because they want to hope. They want to hope that their kid really will stop using. Their kid really will recover this time. Their kid really will get out of prison and stay out of prison, or their kid really will get a job and be able to keep a job. So if there's any way to give that kid another opportunity to resume parenting, they want to have that happen. So they really try to avoid going to court and becoming custodial grandparents. The other reason they try to avoid it is it's a very expensive process. You've got to lawyer up, and a lot of low-income people have no idea how to get a lawyer, how to use a lawyer, how to pay for a lawyer. So that's a big issue. And they don't want to have permanent custodial status unless they absolutely have to. But for grandparents that are just co-residing, so the second category, then it's a bunch of different things. Like, we don't have very much affordable housing. This affects both generations, the generations who are parents and the generations who are grandparents. So sometimes families pool their resources, and they're trying to find a way for all of them to be able to live more cheaply so that they don't have to spend all of their money on housing. In the United States, we basically say if you spend more than a third of your income on housing, that you are housing burdened. And if you can get into subsidized housing, they limit your pay, the amount you pay, to 1/3, so that you won't be more than 1/3. And for other people, though, many people in the United States are housing burdened. They're paying much more than a third of their income toward their housing. So the lack of affordable housing is a big deal. And if you happen to need any accommodations, if you have a disability, you need a place without steps, it is just that much more expensive. Those are the most expensive apartments in any complex, the ones that are accessible. And we're in a situation now where 4% of our housing is accessible. That's it, 4%. So there's a lot of competition for that, and that drives rent for those things up. It's a similar story with the lack of affordable childcare. It's very hard to find childcare that you can rely on, that you can afford. And this is particularly true since COVID, because so many small kind of mom and pop operations closed down during COVID, and they've not been able to reestablish their businesses. So there's many fewer options now than there were before COVID, and families are struggling to find childcare that they can afford and that they can rely on. So if grandma and grandpa move in, then they can maybe provide a lot more childcare, and they might even be providing it for free. In fact, most of the people I've interviewed are providing it for free, although some do accept money. And then finally, there really are some cultural preferences. So certain, especially Asian families, have a long history of preferring multiple generation families. And we do see more cohabitation among African-American families sometimes. And so there are some trends like that where we see cultural preferences also driving it. But there's, big picture factors. So one of the things that I like to say is, when you think about food insecurity, you think, let's make sure people have food. And I think, let's make sure they have a way to get to the food, and let's make sure they've got affordable housing. So if we change affordable housing, we would help reduce food insecurity. If we would make buses more available and cheaper to use, we would reduce food insecurity. So part of our point in the book, Food for Thought, is the causes of food insecurity are broad. So our solutions to food insecurity have to be very broad.
That's such an important perspective to keep in mind. And then I'd love to just the last couple minutes talk a bit about your sample. I mean, I think part of this is obviously, I'm sure, difficult to discern causality on some of these things, right? So the grandparents who are, providing for grandchildren are more likely to experience food insecurity themselves. Part of this is they're probably more likely to be in that role when there is a larger family need for resources to, say, feed and care for the children. But your point, and you can push back on me if I have that wrong, but I think your point also in the development of your sample was not to develop a representative sample, as you were saying, to draw generalizations to a population, but you had a theoretical sample. And I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit more like how did you find these people? What were the criteria for participation in the study? Just so we hear a little bit more about who did you want to
Yeah.
hear from and why? Yeah.
Well, this is a story of multiple failures, years of failures. So I guess it's maybe a story about having perseverance to stick it out. We got funding for this about 5 minutes before COVID hit. So the way we were going to recruit was at subsidized housing places, at food pantries, at soup kitchens, at churches, at YMCAs, at rec centers where older people exercise. We were going to be out and about and recruiting, and we were hoping to do the interviews live. All of that was eliminated overnight when everything shut down with COVID. And in fact, as researchers, we were prohibited from having any contact with any human beings at all, lest we would give them COVID. So, and I agreed with that completely. So we spent 2 years and a lot of money futilely trying all different kinds of ways to get our respondents. A lot of people told me you can get a phone bank, you pay for a phone bank from Cornell University, and you can give them criteria. And we did that. And we made cold calls around the clock for weeks. And we never got a single person who answered their phone, not one. So that was a failure. We also mailed out flyers to like all these places that I just mentioned, the food pantries and the subsidized housing places, and said, post these and have people call us and we'll interview them by phone. And the places were too shut down. So even if there was a person there to open the envelope and get our flyer, there was nobody there to see the flyer once it was posted. So that really didn't work very much at all. It did eventually, as things start to open back up, we did start to get some calls that way. What eventually worked was we put ads on Facebook and Craigslist, and that's where we started to get people who responded. We gave people a $50 honorarium if they completed an interview, and we gave them a preloaded credit card that had $50 on it. And that is when we finally started to get people. So we spent more than 2 years trying to do interviews and got none. And then in a very short amount of time, I think 6 months, we did all 63 of the interviews. And so, yeah, right. So they are volunteers. I mean, we recruited volunteers. We made a point of making sure we had almost every state. We do have almost every state. And we made a point, like we reached a point where we said, for a little while, let's only try to get men, to try to have more men in our sample. And so, every now and then we would try to adjust that way. But yeah, it was difficult. It was very, very difficult.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, we have, as you and I were talking about before the hour, we have a lot of folks on the call who are master students and doctoral students and postdocs. And so to hear your story of, how do we get data, particularly for, populations whose stories are not being told is so very important.
Right.
Really,
And this was a group of people who were particularly at risk with COVID. So
yeah.
anybody over 60 was considered at risk. Anybody low income with any health problems, nearly everyone we spoke to had at least a couple comorbidities. I mean, I read off a couple of lists for you just in these quotes. People had a lot of health conditions and a lot of health problems. So they were very high risk. So they couldn't really be out and about. Some of the people we interviewed were icing bad knees during the interview. One woman was walking home from the food pantry. She was trying to do the interview with us. We had to stop it and just come back to her later when she was situated back at home. So yeah, these are people who needed to be protected. I mean, I was glad that the rule was we couldn't interview them in person because there was no way I wanted to be giving anybody COVID. This is a risky population or a group that's at risk. And, some of them without health insurance.
Well, thank you for bringing their voices to us and for your clarity of thinking around the policy issues. Hopefully we'll have, others on this call will pick up your message and be part of carrying it on. We're enormously appreciative. Please join me in thanking our speaker. We're so appreciative for your talk today. For those of us who can join us, continue to participate in the seminar. Love the virtual applause. Please join us next week. Allison Damager is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's going to be presenting on what's on her mind, the mental load of family life. So we'll continue this journey again at the boundaries of work and family. And Ashley Judd just added, and it is the Ashley Judd, just added in the chat. My grandparents worked past retirement to feed and clothe me as a child. Thank you, she says. So we'll leave it there. Thank you, Ashley. Greatly appreciative to everyone for joining us. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you all for including me in your speaker series. I appreciate it.